A biased law enforcement officer presumes a black individual in the park is a lawbreaker and detains him without cause. Later, the officer discovers he has apprehended an FBI operative. Elijah Carter rested on an aged bench in Greenhaven Park, the late afternoon sunlight bathing the verdant foliage in a golden hue. He flipped a page in the novel he was engrossed in, briefly immersed in the soft whisper of leaves and the far-off giggles of children at play. The park was a cherished retreat, a tranquil haven in a lively city where he could unwind and escape the pressures of his career. Today, however, his peace was disrupted. Across the park, Officer Nathan Brooks patrolled the grounds, his keen gaze sweeping the area. With over 20 years on this route, he believed he understood the city better than most. When he spotted Elijah seated alone on the bench, a gut instinct stirred, a hunch he had come to rely on over time. A black man sitting by himself, too serene, too collected. Doubt crept into his mind. Never seen him here before, Nathan mumbled under his breath. He paused, observing Elijah for a moment, trying to pinpoint the unease. There had been reports of a suspect vaguely matching Elijah's description, a weak, unsubstantiated lead, but sufficient for Nathan. Elijah sensed someone watching him and glanced up from his book. He noticed Nathan standing at a distance, staring with a look Elijah knew all too well. He had faced such situations before and could easily interpret the officer's expression, bias disguised as vigilance, a suspicion rooted solely in his skin color. Yet Elijah remained composed, gently closing his book, marking the page with a finger, and meeting Nathan's stare. Nathan's grip on his baton tightened. Elijah's steady, fearless gaze unsettled him. "Let's see what this guy's up to," Nathan muttered, approaching Elijah with a stiffened posture. He disliked Elijah's calmness, the absence of fear. It was disconcerting. Elijah watched Nathan draw near, keeping his face impassive. He anticipated what was coming, having encountered it many times before. The situation was already charged, and he knew his response in the next few moments could shape its outcome. He wasn't in the mood for this, but he also refused to give the officer any reason to escalate matters. "Good afternoon," Nathan said upon reaching the bench, his tone courteous but laced with suspicion. Elijah could hear the underlying distrust. "Good afternoon," Elijah responded, his voice steady and even. He kept his hands in plain sight, resting them on the closed book in his lap. "What brings you here today?" Nathan asked, his eyes scrutinizing Elijah's face before darting to the book. He was probing for something, anything, to validate his unease. "Just enjoying the park," Elijah replied. "It's a pleasant day." Nathan nodded slowly, though he wasn't truly listening. He was more focused on what Elijah wasn't saying, on what he might uncover. "You from around here?" Elijah offered a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." The vague response irritated Nathan. He shifted his stance, adopting a more confrontational posture. "Mind if I see some ID?" Elijah's smile vanished. This was the moment where things could turn problematic. He knew his rights, knew he wasn't required to show ID for simply sitting in a public park, but he also understood that refusing could escalate the situation quickly. Still, he wasn't about to let this officer intimidate him. "Am I under arrest?" Elijah asked, his tone calm but firm, holding Nathan's gaze without wavering. Nathan stiffened at the question. That composure, that refusal to be cowed, unnerved him. It made him feel like he was losing control. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Nathan snapped, his hand resting on his holster. Elijah took a slow breath, maintaining his neutral expression. He didn't like the direction this was heading, but he wasn't going to back down. "I'm just sitting in a park," he said, his voice steady. "Is there a law against that?" Nathan's patience was thinning. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though even he knew the excuse was flimsy. He stepped closer, looming over Elijah. Elijah didn't budge, holding Nathan's gaze, refusing to give the reaction the officer sought. "And what description is that?" Elijah asked quietly. Nathan's jaw clenched. He lacked a solid answer and knew it, but admitting that would mean losing face, losing control. He wasn't about to let that happen. "Don't get smart with me," he barked. "Show me some ID now." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension between them intensifying. Elijah knew he could assert his rights, but he also recognized that doing so could make the situation more dangerous. For now, he chose to comply. Without a word, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and retrieved his wallet. Nathan watched every movement closely, his body tense, ready to react. When Elijah handed over his ID, Nathan snatched it and glanced at it. The name meant nothing to him, but that didn't matter, he'd already made up his mind. "Stand up," Nathan ordered, stepping back to give Elijah space. Elijah sighed inwardly but complied, rising slowly from the bench, keeping his hands visible to avoid giving Nathan any excuse to feel threatened. "Turn around," Nathan said, pulling out handcuffs. Elijah felt a wave of frustration but suppressed it. He turned, allowing Nathan to cuff him without resistance. He could hear people nearby, could feel their stares, but he remained calm, knowing that giving in to anger would be the worst move now. As Nathan tightened the cuffs around Elijah's wrists, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that he was making a mistake. But his pride wouldn't let him stop. He grabbed Elijah's arm and began leading him toward the patrol car parked nearby. Elijah stayed silent as they walked, his mind already shifting to what would follow. He wasn't worried about himself, he knew who he was, knew the officer would soon find out. But he felt a deep weariness, a fatigue that went beyond this encounter. It was the exhaustion of knowing that, despite his achievements and efforts, too many people like Officer Nathan Brooks still saw him as just another black man. At the patrol car, Nathan opened the back door and guided Elijah inside, the tension still palpable. Elijah settled into the seat, the cold metal of the cuffs pressing into his wrists. He gazed out the window as the car pulled away from the park, watching the trees blur by, wondering how this day, like so many others, had gone so wrong. The patrol car's engine purred as Officer Nathan Brooks drove Elijah Carter toward the station. His grip on the steering wheel was firm, his knuckles pale as he reflected on what had just transpired. He didn't like how Elijah had looked at him back in the park, calm, unafraid, as if he knew something Nathan didn't. It gnawed at him, made him question his instincts, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. Elijah sat quietly in the back, hands cuffed behind him. The city streets passed in a blur, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He was focused on what would happen next. He understood the system, knew how quickly things could spiral if he wasn't careful. But he also knew the authority he held, an authority Officer Brooks was oblivious to. As they approached the station, Nathan glanced at Elijah in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Elijah met Nathan's eyes in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he said calmly. "I was just reading." Nathan scoffed. "A guy like you, just sitting around reading? You expect me to believe that?" Elijah raised an eyebrow. "A guy like me," he repeated, his tone measured. Nathan hesitated, realizing his words had slipped, but instead of retreating, he doubled down. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in parks," he said, trying to justify himself. Elijah didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch, the tension in the car growing thicker. When he finally spoke, his voice was cool and controlled. "And what does someone like me look like, officer?" Nathan had no answer. He knew what he was implying, knew how it sounded, but he wasn't about to admit it to Elijah or himself. Instead, he focused on driving, his frustration mounting as Elijah's calm demeanor continued to unsettle him. The car pulled into the station's parking lot, and Nathan parked near the entrance. He got out first, then opened the back door and helped Elijah out, the cuffs still digging into Elijah's wrists. As they walked toward the building, Nathan's thoughts raced. He needed to figure out his next move. This wasn't how arrests were supposed to go. The suspect was supposed to be nervous, compliant, not composed and challenging him with every word. Inside the station, the usual hum of activity filled the air, officers filing reports, phones ringing, conversations buzzing. Nathan led Elijah through the main hall, ignoring curious glances from colleagues. He wasn't ready to explain himself yet, not until he was certain of his next step. They reached the booking area, and Nathan signaled for Elijah to stand by the processing desk. The officer behind it, a young man named Officer Thompson, looked up, surprised to see Nathan with someone in custody. "What's this about?" Thompson asked, his eyes flicking to Elijah, then back to Nathan. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Nathan replied, his tone curt. He handed over Elijah's ID, still unwilling to admit he lacked a solid reason for the arrest. Thompson glanced at the ID, then at Elijah. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but he quickly masked it, nodding as he began typing. Elijah noticed the hesitation, storing it in his mind. Someone here knew who he was. "Captain Coleman's in her office," Thompson said, returning the ID to Nathan. "You'll need to take him to her." Nathan stiffened. Captain Sarah Coleman was known for being tough but fair, a stickler for protocol. He hadn't planned on involving her so soon, but he had no choice. "All right," Nathan said, his voice tight. He turned to Elijah, gripping his arm firmly. "Let's go." Elijah walked beside Nathan, his expression still impassive. He could sense Nathan's tension, the uncertainty the officer was trying to hide. It was the first crack in his armor, and Elijah noted it with quiet satisfaction. Nathan knocked on Captain Coleman's door, opening it when he heard her voice. The office was tidy, with a large desk at the center and shelves lined with books and files. Captain Coleman, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her paperwork as they entered. "Officer Brooks," she said, her tone neutral. "What's this about?" Nathan stepped forward, guiding Elijah into the room. "Caught this guy in the park, Captain. He was acting suspicious, wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Captain Coleman's gaze shifted to Elijah, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of recognition, just like Thompson's, but she quickly masked it, her expression professional. "Is that so?" she said evenly. Elijah met her eyes, seeing the recognition there. He knew Captain Coleman was aware of who he was, but she was playing it carefully, waiting to see how Nathan would proceed. "That's right," Nathan continued, unaware of the silent exchange. "I brought him in for questioning." Captain Coleman nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I see. And did you have probable cause to arrest him?" Nathan hesitated, feeling the ground shift beneath him. He wouldn't cooperate, Captain, he repeated, though it sounded weaker now. Captain Coleman leaned back, studying Nathan carefully. Officer Brooks, why don't you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Mr. Davis alone. Nathan blinked, caught off guard. But, Captain. Outside, Brooks, Coleman said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Nathan released Elijah and stepped out, closing the door. As soon as he was gone, Captain Coleman's demeanor softened slightly. Mr. Davis, she said calmly, I apologize for this misunderstanding. Elijah allowed a small smile. No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job. Coleman sighed, glancing at the closed door. I'm aware of who you are, but I'd appreciate if we kept that quiet for now. I need to handle this carefully. Elijah nodded. Of course. I'm not here to cause trouble, Captain. I just want to ensure things are handled properly. They will be, Coleman assured him. I'll speak with Officer Brooks and deal with this appropriately. But I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you are? Elijah's smile faded, his expression turning serious. Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. My identity shouldn't be the reason he treats me with respect. Captain Coleman considered his words, then nodded. You're right. It shouldn't matter, but unfortunately, it does to some people. The room fell silent, the weight of the situation lingering. Finally, Captain Coleman stood. I'll call Officer Brooks back in. We'll resolve this. Elijah nodded, watching as she moved to the door. The confrontation wasn't over, but he knew he held the advantage now. The truth would soon emerge, and Officer Brooks would face the consequences. As Captain Coleman opened the door, Nathan stepped back inside, his expression wary. He sensed something had shifted but didn't know what. He glanced at Elijah, who stood calmly, waiting. Mr. Davis here is not the man you were looking for, Coleman said. You'll release him immediately. Nathan blinked, the words sinking in slowly. What? But, Captain. Immediately, Officer, Coleman repeated, her voice firm. Nathan hesitated, then reached for the keys to unlock Elijah's handcuffs. His hands trembled slightly as he did so, the realization of his mistake dawning. As the cuffs clicked open, Elijah rubbed his wrists, giving Nathan a measured look. Thank you, officer, Elijah said, his tone calm but carrying a note of finality. Nathan swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. You're free to go, he muttered, stepping back. Elijah nodded and turned to Captain Coleman. I'll be in touch, Captain, he said quietly. There's still much to discuss. Captain Coleman nodded in return, understanding the weight of his words. I look forward to it, Mr. Davis. With that, Elijah walked out of the office, leaving Nathan with a sinking feeling in his gut. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Nathan Brooks sat at his desk in the station, the tension in his body unrelenting. He had barely been able to focus since Captain Coleman released Elijah Carter. The unease gnawed at him, deepened by the fact that he still didn't fully grasp what had happened. He knew he had erred, but the full scope of his mistake remained elusive. The station's quiet hum only amplified his discomfort. The quietness of the station around him was both soothing and unsettling, a space where his thoughts could spiral unchecked. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps nearing his desk jolted him from his reverie. He glanced up to see Captain Coleman approaching, her face stern. Nathan's stomach knotted, he knew this wouldn't be a casual chat. Officer Brooks, "My office now," Captain Coleman ordered, her voice firm and unyielding. Nathan rose immediately, struggling to quell the anxiety creeping into his demeanor. He followed her to her office, each step heavier than the last. Inside, Captain Coleman shut the door and motioned for him to sit. Nathan paused briefly before taking a seat, sensing the heavy tension in the room, the unspoken gravity of what was to come. Captain Coleman moved behind her desk, took a deep breath, and sat across from him, her piercing gaze locked on his. "Officer Brooks," she began, her tone calm but severe, "do you have any clue who Elijah Carter is?" Nathan shook his head, his confusion growing. "No, Captain. Just some person in the park." Captain Coleman leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "Elijah Carter isn't just some person in the park. He's a special agent, one of the FBI's finest, in fact." The words struck Nathan like a physical hit, his eyes widening as the weight of his actions crashed over him. "An FBI agent," he echoed, his voice barely audible. "That's correct," Coleman confirmed, her tone resolute. "And more than that, he's highly regarded in the Bureau. His arrest will have serious repercussions, not just for you but for this entire station." Nathan's mind raced, grappling with the implications. He had profiled and detained an innocent man, a federal agent, no less, based solely on his own prejudiced assumptions. The magnitude of his error settled over him, bringing a cold, creeping dread. "I didn't know, Captain," Nathan said, his voice trembling. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the issue, Brooks," Coleman replied, her tone unwavering. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. Your actions stemmed from bias and assumptions, not from any real evidence. You can't detain someone just because they don't seem to belong in a park." Nathan wanted to protest, to justify himself, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew Captain Coleman was right. He had let his prejudices guide his actions, and now he faced the consequences. "What happens now?" Nathan asked, his voice low, almost defeated. Captain Coleman sighed, leaning back in her chair. "For now, you're on temporary leave while we investigate this incident. I've already spoken with the higher-ups, and they're far from pleased. There will be an official review, and depending on its findings, you could face disciplinary measures, including possible termination." Nathan's heart sank. Termination, the word lingered like a death knell. He had been a police officer for over 20 years, and the thought of losing his career was almost unbearable. Yet, he knew he had only himself to blame. "I understand, Captain," Nathan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Coleman studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "I know this is hard to hear, Brooks, but you need to realize that your actions have consequences, not just for you but for the community you serve. We can't afford officers who let bias dictate their decisions." Nathan nodded, though his mind was still reeling. The reality of his situation was sinking in, bringing a wave of regret. He had always prided himself on being a good officer, someone who upheld the law and protected the public. But now, all of that was at risk because of one reckless, biased decision. Captain Coleman stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "You're dismissed, Officer Brooks. I'll notify you when the review is scheduled." Nathan rose, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Thank you, Captain," he muttered before turning and leaving the office. As he exited the station, the familiar sights and sounds that once comforted him now felt distant, almost foreign. He walked to his car in a daze, the reality of his situation pressing down like a thick fog. He had been a cop for so long that he didn't know who he was without the badge. The thought of losing it, of being labeled a failure, terrified him. But beneath the fear, there was something else, a new sense of doubt. For the first time, Nathan was forced to confront the possibility that he wasn't the honorable officer he had always believed himself to be, that perhaps his biases had shaped his actions more than he cared to admit. As he drove home, the city streets blurring past, Nathan couldn't shake the image of Elijah Carter's calm, unyielding gaze. It was a look that had unsettled him from the start, and now he understood why. Elijah had seen through him, had understood the situation even before Nathan did. When Nathan finally reached home, he sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. The day's events replayed in his mind, each loop making the weight of his actions heavier. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew his life had changed irrevocably. With a heavy sigh, Nathan stepped out of the car and entered his house. The silence of the empty rooms pressed in on him. He sank into a chair, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, regret, and uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to do next. Nathan Brooks stood in the hallway outside the conference room, his heart pounding. The station was quieter than usual, the atmosphere thick with anticipation of what was about to unfold. The official review was about to begin, and Nathan knew that every word he spoke in the next hour could shape his career's future. He glanced at his reflection in a nearby window. The man staring back looked older, more worn than he had just days ago. There was a rigidity in his posture, a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and forced himself to focus. This was his chance to explain, to justify his actions, though deep down, he wasn't sure how to do that anymore. The conference room door opened, and Captain Coleman appeared, her expression unreadable. "We're ready for you, Officer Brooks," she said, her voice steady. Nathan nodded, swallowing hard as he followed her inside. The room's atmosphere was tense. The long table was lined with stern-faced officials, representatives from the precinct's Internal Affairs Division, a few high-ranking officers, and, at the far end, a man in a suit Nathan instantly recognized as Elijah Carter. Elijah's presence hit like a blow to the stomach. Nathan had hoped he wouldn't be there, that he wouldn't have to face him again. But there he was, sitting calmly, his eyes fixed on Nathan as if studying him. The look in those eyes was the same as before, calm, unflinching, but with a quiet authority that made Nathan feel diminished. Captain Coleman took her seat at the head of the table, motioning for Nathan to sit opposite. He did so, trying to ignore the sweat on his palms. The room was silent, the weight of judgment heavy in the air. "Officer Brooks," Coleman began, her tone formal, "this review is to assess the appropriateness of your actions during the arrest of Mr. Elijah Carter. We will examine the events leading up to the arrest, your conduct during it, and the consequences that followed. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" "Yes, Captain," Nathan replied, his voice low but steady. He glanced briefly at Elijah, who watched him intently, before returning his focus to Coleman. "Good," Coleman said, nodding. "Let's start with the incident report. According to your statement, you arrested Mr. Davis because you believed he was a suspect in a recent series of robberies. Is that correct?" Nathan nodded. "Yes, Captain. I saw him in the park, and he matched the description we had, tall black male, early 40s. He was acting suspiciously, so I approached him." "And what exactly was suspicious about his behavior?" Coleman asked, her tone neutral but probing. Nathan hesitated, knowing his answer was critical. He was alone, just sitting there, and when I asked for his ID, he was evasive. Evasive how? Coleman pressed. He didn't want to show me his ID right away, Nathan explained, though the words sounded weak even to him. He seemed like he was hiding something. Elijah's voice cut through the air, calm but firm. I was reading a book, Officer Brooks. Not exactly the behavior of a criminal on the run. Nathan flinched slightly at Elijah's words but kept his focus on Coleman. I was just doing my job, Captain. I was trying to protect the community. And did you find anything on Mr. Davis that indicated he was involved in any criminal activity? Coleman asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Nathan shook his head. No, ma'am. He was clean. A heavy silence filled the room as everyone processed the exchange. Then, an internal affairs officer spoke, his voice stern. Officer Brooks, did it ever occur to you that Mr. Davis might have been telling the truth? That he wasn't the suspect you were looking for? Nathan hesitated, his mind scrambling for the right words. I was following protocol. We're trained to be cautious, to assume someone might be dangerous until proven otherwise. But did you consider that your assumptions might have been influenced by factors other than protocol? The officer asked pointedly. Nathan's throat tightened. He knew what they were implying, and he had no good response. I didn't mean to profile him, he said, his voice faltering. I was just doing my job. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on Nathan. Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Brooks, not to judge people based on their appearance. Nathan met Elijah's eyes, feeling a surge of defensiveness, quickly followed by guilt. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when he was wrong, and this was one of those times. Captain Coleman cleared her throat, drawing attention back to her. Officer Brooks, this review isn't just about what happened that day. It's about the mindset that led to your actions. We need to ensure every officer in this precinct upholds fairness and justice. This isn't just about you, it's about the integrity of the entire police force. Nathan felt a sinking sensation in his gut. He realized this wasn't just about a mistake, it was about whether he was fit to wear the badge. The realization hit hard, and for a moment, he struggled to speak. I understand, Captain, he finally said, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean to, I didn't want to, he stopped, the words catching in his throat. Captain Coleman softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. We all make mistakes, Brooks, but it's how we address those mistakes that defines us. You need to think carefully about the kind of officer you want to be. A long pause followed, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. Then Elijah spoke again, his voice calm but authoritative. Captain Coleman, may I say something? Coleman nodded. Of course, Mr. Davis. Elijah stood, his presence commanding the room. He looked directly at Nathan, his expression serious but not unkind. I understand that being a police officer is a challenging job. You face constant pressure, and sometimes that pressure leads to poor decisions. But we can't allow those poor decisions to go unaddressed. This isn't just about holding Officer Brooks accountable, it's about ensuring this doesn't happen again. Nathan listened, his heart heavy. He knew Elijah was right, but the truth was hard to accept. He had spent his career believing he was doing the right thing, but now he faced the reality that his actions had caused harm, that his biases had blinded him to the truth. Elijah continued, his voice steady. I'm not here to ruin anyone's career, but I am here to ensure that the next time an officer encounters someone like me, they think twice before making assumptions. This is an opportunity for change, and I hope this precinct takes it seriously." Captain Coleman nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Davis. Your words are noted." Elijah sat down, his gaze still on Nathan. There was no malice in his eyes, but there was a firmness, a resolve that made it clear he wouldn't tolerate further injustice. Captain Coleman looked at Nathan, her tone softer but still authoritative. "Officer Brooks, you'll remain on temporary leave while we continue this review. I suggest you use this time to reflect on what's been said here today. We'll reconvene in a few days to discuss the next steps." Nathan nodded numbly, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "Yes, Captain," he said quietly. The meeting adjourned, and as the officials filed out, Nathan remained seated, his mind racing. He had entered the review hoping to defend himself, to justify his actions, but now all he could think about was how wrong he had been. The realization was a cold, hard truth he couldn't escape. As the last officials left, Nathan stood slowly, his movements heavy with the burden of his thoughts. He glanced at Elijah one last time, and their eyes met. There was no animosity in Elijah's gaze, just a quiet determination to see justice done. Nathan looked away, unable to hold the gaze any longer. He knew he had much to reflect on, much to come to terms with. As he left the conference room, the weight of his actions and their consequences hung over him like a dark cloud. Captain Sarah Coleman sat in her office, staring at the pile of reports on her desk. Each document represented a piece of the truth she was working to assemble. The internal investigation into Nathan Brooks's conduct was underway, and it was her duty to ensure every detail was thoroughly examined. She rubbed her temples, feeling the tension in her shoulders. The precinct had always prided itself on high standards, but this incident had shaken that foundation. Whatever the outcome, Coleman knew the investigation would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Nathan but for the entire department. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the first report, the initial witness statements from the park. She had read them multiple times, but each review added weight to the evidence against Nathan. The witnesses, all parkgoers present during the arrest, described the event with stark clarity. Their accounts were consistent. Nathan had approached Elijah Carter assuming he was a criminal, without hesitation and without attempting to de-escalate. Coleman turned to the body cam footage report. She had watched it several times, each viewing more unsettling than the last. The footage was clear and unambiguous. Nathan's voice, tone, and body language reflected the assumptions he had made from the moment he saw Elijah. The aggression in his approach, the way he dismissed Elijah's attempts to explain, the force he used during the arrest, it was all there, laid bare for anyone to see. A knock at the door pulled Coleman from her thoughts. She looked up to see Detective Mitchell, her second-in-command for the investigation, standing in the doorway. "I've got the last of the witness interviews," Mitchell said, holding up a file. "And I've scheduled Elijah Carter for later this afternoon." "Thanks, Mitchell," Coleman replied, taking the file. "How's it going?" Mitchell asked, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "Not great, Captain," Coleman replied grimly. "Most witnesses are clear about what they observed, and from what I can tell, the body cam footage supports their accounts." Coleman nodded, her expression somber. "I was worried about that. Are we bringing Nathan in for another round of questioning?" "Yes," Mitchell confirmed. "Let's see if he's ready to speak more candidly about what happened." Mitchell nodded and exited, leaving Coleman alone with the file. She opened it and began reviewing the new witness statements. They aligned with the others. Nathan had been confrontational from the outset, and Elijah had clearly tried to de-escalate, but Nathan hadn't listened. As Coleman finished reading, a deep unease settled over her. She had known Nathan for years. He had always been a dependable officer. But this incident revealed a side of him she hadn't seen before. The hours dragged on as Coleman pored over the evidence. Finally, a knock at her door announced Mitchell's return, followed by Nathan. "Come in, Brooks," Coleman said, keeping her tone even. Nathan looked drained, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. He sat across from Coleman, casting a nervous glance at Mitchell, who took a seat beside him. "We're going to review the events of that day again," Coleman said, leaning forward slightly. "I need you to be completely honest, Nathan. This is your chance to share your perspective." Nathan nodded, his expression tense. "I understand, Captain." Coleman glanced at Mitchell, who began the questioning. "Nathan, walk us through what was on your mind when you first saw Elijah Carter in the park." Nathan hesitated, his gaze shifting as he searched for words. "I saw a man who matched the suspect's description we were looking for. It was a high-pressure situation, and I had to make a quick call." "And what made you so certain he was the suspect?" Mitchell pressed. "He fit the description," Nathan repeated, his voice growing defensive. "We were looking for a black male, similar height and build. He was acting suspiciously, like he was concealing something." Coleman could hear the strain in Nathan's voice, the way he clung to justifications. "Nathan, the witness statements and body cam footage tell a different story," she said. "They show Elijah Carter was cooperative, that he tried to explain who he was, but you didn't listen." Nathan shifted uncomfortably. "He was trying to throw me off, buying time. I was just following my training, Captain." "Your training?" Coleman repeated, her tone sharp. "Nathan, your training doesn't justify racial profiling. It doesn't excuse escalating a situation that didn't need to be escalated." Nathan opened his mouth to respond, but Coleman raised a hand to stop him. "Look, Nathan, I'm not here to debate. I'm here to uncover the truth. The evidence we've gathered so far isn't in your favor. It shows you made assumptions based on race, and those assumptions led to an unjust arrest." A long silence followed as Nathan processed her words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I was just trying to do my job." Coleman sighed. "I know, Nathan, but intent doesn't erase the impact of your actions. This isn't just about you, it's about what your actions represent and how they affect the people we're supposed to protect." Before Nathan could reply, another knock came at the door. Mitchell stood and opened it, revealing Elijah Carter, who entered with a calm, composed demeanor. "Mr. Davis, thank you for coming," Coleman said, standing to shake his hand. Elijah nodded, his expression neutral. "Of course, Captain." Coleman gestured for Elijah to sit, then turned to Nathan. "Nathan, we're going to hear from Mr. Davis now. I want you to listen carefully." Nathan nodded, though he couldn't meet Elijah's eyes. Coleman signaled for Mitchell to begin. "Mr. Davis, can you describe your encounter with Officer Brooks from your perspective?" Elijah's voice was steady. "I was at the park, enjoying my day off, when Officer Brooks approached me. He was aggressive from the start, demanding my ID and questioning me as if I were already guilty. I tried to explain that I was an FBI agent, that there must be a mistake, but he didn't listen. He cuffed me, pushed me to the ground, and treated me like a criminal. Nathan flinched at Elijah's words but remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table. Mitchell continued, "Did you feel Officer Brooks's actions were influenced by your race?" Elijah didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. I could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at me, the assumptions he made before I even spoke. I've dealt with this before, but it's different when it comes from someone who's supposed to protect and serve." Coleman saw the impact of Elijah's words on Nathan, his shoulders slumped slightly, and he seemed to shrink into himself. Still, Nathan said nothing. "Thank you, Mr. Davis," Coleman said. "I appreciate your honesty." Elijah nodded, then stood to leave. At the door, he paused and turned back to Nathan. "I don't hold personal grudges, Officer Brooks, but I hope you take this as a chance to learn, to understand the impact of your actions. It's not just about what you intended, it's about how those intentions play out in the real world." With that, Elijah left, leaving a heavy silence. Coleman looked at Nathan, who was still staring at the table. "Nathan, this investigation isn't just about what happened, it's about ensuring it doesn't happen again. We have to do better for the people we serve and for ourselves." Nathan nodded slowly, but there was no fight left in him. The weight of the evidence, Elijah's words, and the reality of his actions were sinking in, though whether he was ready to fully confront that truth was unclear. "Take the rest of the day, Nathan," Coleman said quietly. "We'll reconvene tomorrow." Nathan stood, his movements stiff, and left without another word. As the door closed, Coleman felt a heavy sense of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This investigation was just the beginning, there was much work to do, within the department and beyond. For now, all she could do was piece together the truth and hope it would lead to real change. Captain Sarah Coleman sat in her office, the final investigation report closed on her desk. The conclusion was clear, and the decision was made, but that didn't make the task ahead easier. She glanced at the clock, knowing Elijah Carter would arrive soon. The conversation they were about to have felt like a turning point, not just for Nathan Brooks but for the entire department. A soft knock signaled Elijah's arrival. Coleman stood, smoothing her uniform, preparing for the discussion. "Come in," she called. The door opened, and Elijah entered, his expression calm and composed as always. He gave Coleman a polite nod before sitting across from her. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Davis," Coleman began, sitting down as well. "Of course," Elijah replied, his tone steady. "I assume the investigation is complete?" "It is," Coleman confirmed, leaning forward slightly. "After reviewing all the evidence, witness statements, body cam footage, and interviews, it's been decided that Officer Brooks will be terminated from his position." Elijah nodded slowly, processing the news. "I appreciate the thoroughness of the investigation, Captain, but I have to ask, do you believe this decision will lead to real change within the department?" Coleman paused, choosing her words carefully. "I believe it's a step in the right direction. Nathan Brooks's actions were unacceptable, and his termination sends a clear message that racial profiling and abuse of power won't be tolerated. But I know firing one officer isn't enough to address the deeper issues at play." Elijah's gaze remained steady. "You're right. This is about more than one officer, it's about the culture within the department, the training officers receive, and the biases that influence decisions in the field. If we don't address those underlying factors, incidents like this will keep happening." Coleman nodded, appreciating Elijah's candor. "I agree. This incident has highlighted the need for systemic change, and I'm committed to making that happen. We're already revising our training programs to include more comprehensive education on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. We're also planning stricter oversight and accountability measures. That's a good start, Elijah said, a hint of approval in his voice, but it'll take more than policy changes. It's about changing officers' mindsets, helping them understand the impact their actions have on the communities they serve. That's not something that happens overnight. I know, Coleman admitted. It's a long, difficult process, but it's necessary if we want to rebuild trust and ensure what happened to you doesn't happen to someone else. Elijah leaned back, his expression thoughtful. I've been in law enforcement long enough to know change isn't easy, especially when it involves confronting uncomfortable truths. But I'm willing to work with you, Captain, to help make those changes. This isn't just about me, it's about creating a safer, more just system for everyone. Coleman felt a surge of respect for Elijah. Despite everything, he was still willing to engage, to push for needed reforms. I appreciate that, Mr. Davis, she said sincerely. Your experience and insight will be invaluable as we move forward, and I want you to know your voice will be heard. Elijah nodded. Thank you, Captain. I'm not looking for special treatment, I just want to ensure this department becomes the best version of itself. That's what the community deserves, and what the officers deserve too. Coleman couldn't agree more. You're right, and I promise we're committed to making that happen. The room fell into a comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on the conversation's weight. The decision to fire Nathan Brooks was just the start. The real work lay in the reforms and cultural shift needed to prevent future injustices. As Elijah stood to leave, Coleman rose, extending her hand. Thank you again, Mr. Davis. I look forward to working with you. Elijah shook her hand firmly. Likewise, Captain. Let's make sure this is a turning point, not just a momentary reaction. With that, Elijah left, leaving Coleman alone with her thoughts. She glanced at the closed investigation report one last time before focusing on the future. The decision was made, but now it was up to her and the department to ensure it led to lasting change. She knew the road ahead would be tough, filled with resistance and challenges, but Coleman was ready. This was about more than one officer or one incident, it was about doing what was right, no matter how hard. With renewed determination, Coleman reached for her phone and began making calls to set the reforms in motion. The department needed to evolve, and she would do everything in her power to ensure it did. The morning was overcast as Elijah Carter climbed the precinct steps, the air heavy, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but charged with anticipation. The changes Captain Coleman had promised were taking shape, but the road ahead was long. As Elijah entered, he noticed subtle shifts. A new bulletin board near the entrance displayed details about upcoming workshops on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. Officers moved through the halls with a different energy, their conversations quieter, more serious. The past few weeks had left a lasting mark on everyone. Elijah headed to Captain Coleman's office, nodding politely to officers he passed. Some returned the gesture with respect, while others avoided his gaze, still grappling with the fallout. When he reached Coleman's office, the door was slightly ajar. He knocked softly before pushing it open. "Come in," Coleman called, looking up from her desk. Elijah stepped inside, closing the door. Coleman rose, offering a warm smile. "Good to see you again, Mr. Davis." Likewise, Captain, Elijah replied, taking a seat across from her. I wanted to see how things are progressing. Coleman nodded, her expression serious but determined. We're making progress. The new training programs are rolling out, and we're implementing stricter oversight for accountability. It's a start, but there's still much to do. Elijah appreciated her honesty. Change takes time, but it's encouraging to see the steps you're taking. How's the department handling it? There's been some resistance, Coleman admitted. Not everyone's on board, but most officers understand these changes are necessary. We've had tough conversations, but I'm hopeful we're moving in the right direction. Elijah leaned forward, his gaze intent. That's good to hear. It's important to keep the momentum going to ensure these changes are more than a reaction to one incident. Agreed, Coleman said. This is about building a new foundation for how we operate, one rooted in fairness and respect for everyone we serve. As they spoke, the door opened, and Nathan Brooks stepped inside, his face drawn, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He wore plain clothes, holding a cardboard box, clearly there to collect his belongings. Captain, Nathan greeted Coleman stiffly, avoiding Elijah's eyes. Nathan, Coleman replied, her tone neutral. For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with unresolved tension. Nathan turned to Elijah, his expression tight. Mr. Davis, I just wanted to say I didn't mean for things to turn out like this. Elijah met his gaze calmly. It's not about what you meant, Officer Brooks. It's about what you did and the impact it had. Intentions don't excuse actions. Nathan flinched at Elijah's bluntness but nodded, accepting the truth. I know. I don't know how to fix this. You can start by acknowledging the problem, Elijah said evenly. We all have biases, but it's how we address them that matters. You have the chance to learn from this, to become a better person because of it. Nathan's shoulders slumped, the weight of the situation pressing down. He turned to Coleman, his voice barely audible. I suppose this is it, then. Coleman nodded, her expression softening. It doesn't have to be the end, Nathan. You can still choose to grow from this, to make changes in your life. But that's up to you. Nathan stood for a moment, considering her words, before giving a brief nod. I'll think about it. He paused, then added, Good luck, Captain. And to you as well, Mr. Davis. With that, Nathan turned and left, the door closing softly behind him. Coleman and Elijah watched him go, both lost in thought. Do you think he'll be okay? Elijah asked after a moment. Coleman sighed, leaning back. I hope so, but it's out of our hands now. All we can do is focus on the work ahead. Elijah nodded in agreement. And there's plenty of that. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation lingering. Finally, Elijah stood, extending his hand to Coleman. Thank you for everything, Captain. I appreciate your commitment to making things right. Coleman shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Mr. Davis. Your involvement has been invaluable. We're in this together. With that, Elijah turned and left, making his way through the precinct one last time. As he walked the halls, he felt the officers' eyes on him, some curious, some contemplative. He knew change wouldn't come easily, but it was necessary. The past few weeks had opened a door, and it was up to all of them to walk through it. As Elijah stepped into the cool morning air, he took a deep breath, a sense of resolve settling over him. The path ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to continue the fight for justice. This was just the beginning, and he was determined to see it through. With renewed determination, Elijah walked away from the precinct, his mind already turning to the next steps in his work. There was much more to do, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was coming, and he would be there to help guide it every step of the way.